you have a perspective, historical perspective here. This is not the first time we've had major tech innovation. If you go back to Windows and you look at the smartphone, you look at social media, put this in perspective. What has the government done in the past, and what has it done well and maybe not so well?
Oh, David, thank you. It's great to be back on the program, and it's always good to be with you, so good evening to everyone. You know, as a friend of mine put this, we always dress for yesterday's weather. That's especially true when it comes to regulation, right? Governments tend to apply existing laws and frameworks to new phenomenon, which is a challenge. I'll use two examples. I'll do antitrust and then subsidies or tariffs. And I'm going back to the 80s here, but it's funny how history repeats itself. So take the first suit, which is IBM. It was mostly about a mainframe dominance. It lasted from the last day of the Johnson administration to the start of the Reagan administration, and was finally dismissed. Microsoft, mostly about bundling Windows and browsers, but to think about how relevant that would be today in today's world. So the result is that over time, these suits kind of last so long that the technologies advance and they become mute. I'll give you another example, tariffs and subsidies, since you brought up the CHIPS Act. It might be relevant here as well. In the 80s, the issue was Japan. It wasn't necessarily what's happening from the concerns with China and their supply chain, but it was in semiconductors and mostly memory. Reagan slapped 100% tariffs on chips from Japan. And a year later, Congress approved $500 million to subsidize American chip companies. Those days, that was a lot of money, needless to say. Both efforts fell flat. So why? Well, one thing, all the incentives were around memory chips, and the industry had moved to microprocessors, now called logic. And so we missed it again. And so my point is, it's really, really hard in tech to pick winners and losers because the space just moves so fast. And that's what we're seeing again today.
The Biden administration has a very long executive order out to try to get their arms around the initial stages of, and you're right, generative AI, not just AI generally. I think it's like 170 pages, something like that.
Yeah,
but if you were to advise the government, as you do regularly on these issues, what's the right balance between, on the one hand, running a risk of it getting out of control, going off on its own? Some people would say that happened with social media, actually, at this point, that we let it go too far too fast, as opposed to, on the other hand, regulating and actually suppressing some of the innovation that we need.
Well, actually, you make a great point, and the analogy of the internet and social media is absolutely true. The first comment I would make, it's not just the Biden administration executive order, it's also what the EU is doing, the EU AI Act. I think that's really, really important, because you need to have coordination on a global basis, because all these companies and all these systems are going to operate on a global scale. So that's a positive thing. But from a company's perspective, you need to understand, because you got to play offense and defense. So in playing offense, you need to understand where you can apply the technology, how you can make good use of the technology. So what you really want, and if you're a CEO running these companies, you actually want basically guardrails. You want rules to be established. You want regulation. Now, Ken Chenault and I created this thing called the Data Trust Alliance to look at transparency and integrity of the data and in the operations or in the uses of the data. And it's a couple dozen companies and the CEOs are involved. But where they're coming from, which is different from the technology leaders, they're coming from the perspective is that we don't want you to regulate the technology because that will limit innovation. What we want the government to is regulate the uses of the technology. What are those use cases? And let's look at those use cases, and I'll call it a continuum of risk. So if it's national security, high risk. If it's call centers and those sorts of things, low risk. It's almost, if I take it back to the cyber days when Tom Donilon and I were running the Obama Commission for cyber, we had a continuum of risk. One was no one dies, and the other was photo sharing. So this is how I think, if I was the government, I would suggest to the government, they think about the use cases and how the technology is being applied, not just the technology itself. Because if you influence the usage and you have guardrails established that you get to the standards, because it's going to be hard to have standards day one.
So, Sam, if that all weren't complicated enough, let me add one other potential dimension, and that is China. I mean, as you mentioned, back in the days of the mainframe, Japan was a competitor, but they were perceived as a close ally of the United States. We have China, which is perceived as, in many ways, in an adversarial relationship to the United States and appears to be competing on the question of generative AI, investing an awful lot of money. How does that influence government decisions on how you regulate generative AI? Because obviously, we want to be fully competitive in this area.
you're right. The CCP has declared AI the moonshot for China, and they are investing billions into this space. I mean, I think it was a couple billion 2 years ago in that year alone, which exceeded the Europe and the U.S. combined. Now, having said all that, I think about what's happening today, and just from a pragmatic perspective, look at TikTok, look at Huawei. If you were a U.S. company or any company in the world, would you use a large language foundation model built by the Chinese, given our current experience in AI? I think long and hard about that. Let's say, for example, another thing in AI in China, and that's kind of this bifurcated regulatory environment and all the constraints they have around the technology, especially this technology and foreign investment. Would you make a large investment in China today, in the Chinese market, based upon what we're seeing from the CCP? Well, I'll quote my partner, Jim Breyer, that we worked together in the VC world. He's Breyer Capital. I remember him because he was one of the first investors in Facebook. He has said, and he's right, China is uninvestable. So let's take a pragmatic view before we jump to regulation and all these other sorts of things. Will the private sector actually pursue those opportunities given the environment today? I think they're going to be hesitant. Having said all that, the issue is really deglobalization. Will China decide to rejoin the global world and comply with global standards? I don't know. I mean, no one knows. But unless they do that, there's going to be a hesitancy. So in some ways, I would say a short-term approach is watch the market forces proceed and see what happens before we clamp down and try to create regulations that many times, as you know, you see it in the sanctions, they're very, very hard to enforce.